The air over the Vane estate never felt quite right, heavy, as if thickened by memories no one had bothered to claim. In the summer of 1848, when Eleanor and Marybelle Vane stepped over the rotting threshold of their ancestral home, the land itself seemed to take notice. The cicadas quieted. The wind stilled. Even the servants, who had arrived earlier to air out the sleeping quarters, stood unusually silent, their eyes trained on the warped hallways that bent a little too sharply in the darkest corners. The sisters brushed off the unease at first. Inheritance often came with burdens, they told themselves, dust, decay, debts. But on that first night, as distant thunder rolled across the Mississippi horizon, the house exhaled a slow, deliberate breath. Floorboards creaked where no footsteps fell. Lamps flickered as though reacting to something unseen passing between them. From upstairs, a soft knock echoed through the ceiling, steady and patient, as if announcing the arrival of someone who had always lived here. In the summer of 1848, when Eleanor and Marybelle Vane first approached the long-abandoned family estate, the structure rose before them like a relic of a forgotten century, its once grand facade sinking beneath vines, mildew, and the slow rot of unbroken silence. The inheritance had come abruptly after the death of a distant uncle, a man they barely remembered, a figure who lived in rumor more than in memory. His signature still stained the brittle documents that named them the new owners of the Vane property, and though the legal process was swift, the sense of unease that accompanied it settled more slowly, clinging to the back of their minds like a faint but persistent shadow. The journey to the estate had been long, winding through overgrown paths and washed-out roads, as though the land itself hesitated to lead them to what waited ahead. Upon arriving, they found the house not just abandoned but watchful. Every shattered window seemed to peer outward with a mute kind of expectancy. The servants traveling with them felt the pressure of the air before the sisters even reached the porch. Some paused, glancing toward the field stretching endlessly behind the property, while others avoided looking at the house altogether. The rusted gate had resisted opening, groaning in protest as if guarding secrets too heavy to release. Even the horses grew restless, stamping their hooves and tossing their heads with an instinctive distrust that no amount of coaxing could settle. Inside, the estate was overwhelmed with the scent of damp wood and old grief. Paint hung in curling strips from the walls. Dust coated the floor in a thick film that muted their footsteps. The air carried a coldness untouched by the humid Mississippi heat, the kind that comes not from drafts or broken windows, but from spaces left undisturbed for too long. Eleanor paused just inside the doorway, sensing something off-kilter in the way the light filtered through the hall, muted, distorted, as though it passed through more than dust. Marybelle's fingers traced the pattern carved into the banister, finding grooves she did not recognize, shapes too deliberate to be the result of mere neglect. The legal document they had signed only days earlier lay folded in Eleanor's satchel, crisp and official, yet somehow irrelevant in this place where ink and signatures felt flimsy compared to the weight of lineage. The moment their names were etched onto the inheritance papers, something in the estate had shifted, awakened, stirred. The house was theirs by law, but ownership was never meant to be simple here. Bound to the Vane bloodline long before they were born, the estate seemed almost to inhale as the sisters crossed the threshold, acknowledging them not as strangers but as descendants returning to claim more than land or walls, stepping unknowingly into a legacy neither of them had been prepared to face. The first night on the estate settled over the house like a heavy drape, swallowing the last traces of daylight until even the lanterns seemed to burn weaker than usual. Eleanor and Marybelle tried to dismiss the unease that clung to the rooms, attributing the silence and stillness to the long years of abandonment, but the servants moved with a cautious, almost reverent quiet that suggested something more. They unpacked only what was necessary, leaving trunks half-closed as if unsure whether they would remain beyond the night. When the sisters retired to their respective rooms, exhaustion tugged at them, yet sleep felt slow to come, blocked by a subtle tension neither could explain. It was some time after midnight, when the wind outside had died completely, that the house released a sound unlike anything they had heard before. It was soft at first, no louder than the rustling of fabric, but it carried a shape, a cadence, something too deliberate to be the natural settling of wood. Eleanor awoke to the faint whisper threading along the hallway, brushing against the cracks beneath her door as though seeking a listener. The voice was indistinct, neither male nor female, but undeniably human in pattern, murmuring in a tone that suggested a conversation without words. She sat upright, breath caught in her throat, straining to decipher the noise, yet it seemed to ebb and flow beyond comprehension, like the echo of a memory rather than speech. Across the hall, Marybelle heard it too. She found herself rooted to her bed, fingers gripping the blanket as she listened to the whispers move, drifting from one end of the corridor to the other with an eerie smoothness untouched by footsteps. She considered calling out to Eleanor but felt a strange heaviness in her chest, as if the very walls discouraged interrupting whatever passed through them. The lantern at her bedside flickered twice before dimming to a weak, trembling glow that cast long, uncertain shadows across the room. Several servants, sleeping in the downstairs quarters, reported later that the whispers seemed to float through the floorboards, threading between rooms with an unsettling awareness. Some described the sensation of being observed by something unseen. Others claimed the whispers formed words they could almost understand, though none were able, or willing, to repeat them. A chill lingered in the halls long after the sound subsided, settling into the corners like a residue left behind. By dawn, the sisters had not spoken of the night, each hoping the other had slept soundly, though the dark circles beneath their eyes betrayed the truth. The whispers, too faint to catch yet too persistent to ignore, became the first indication that the house had not been waiting empty all those years, and that their arrival had stirred something awake. In the days following the unsettling whispers that drifted through the halls, the servants grew increasingly uneasy, moving through the estate with an alertness that bordered on fear. Though they attempted to keep their composure in the presence of the sisters, their exchanged glances and lowered voices betrayed their discomfort. The house had an uncanny way of amplifying their unease, sounds carried too far, and shadows clung too long, as though the lingering presence of something unseen pressed into the very structure of the walls. Eleanor and Marybelle noticed the shift but hesitated to question it, unsure whether the servants sensed something tangible or were simply reacting to the oppressive atmosphere permeating the estate. It began subtly at first. A servant named Ruth claimed she heard footsteps in the upper corridors while cleaning the front parlor, though both sisters had been outside tending to trunks at the time. The footsteps, she said, were slow, measured, and unmistakably human, but when she called out, more from instinct than expectation, the sound halted abruptly. Another servant, Caleb, reported seeing a figure at the end of the west wing hallway. He described it as tall and still, standing half in shadow, its outline blurred yet undeniably human in shape. When he approached, lantern trembling in his grip, the figure dissolved into the darkness as though it had never been there at all. The tension worsened during the evening hours, when the house seemed to come alive with faint echoes that traveled just beyond the edges of hearing. Doors would creak open despite no draft strong enough to move them. Fabrics in storage rooms rustled as if brushed by unseen hands. The servants had initially dismissed these occurrences as tricks of the mind brought on by fatigue, but the episodes grew too frequent, too consistent, to be ignored. They whispered among themselves that the estate was restless, awakened by the sisters' return after decades without a vain presence in its halls. Eleanor began noticing that the servants lingered near one another whenever possible, unwilling to traverse the upper floor alone. Marybelle, too, caught them pausing at the base of the staircase, staring upward as though expecting someone, or something, to appear at the landing. She found Caleb one afternoon standing motionless in the central hallway, eyes fixed on an empty stretch of wall. When she asked what he was looking at, he hesitated, then muttered that he thought he saw someone pass by, though no sound had accompanied the movement. Their accounts grew harder to dismiss when all of them, on separate occasions, reported hearing the same phenomenon, the unmistakable shuffle of feet in the attic. The problem was simple yet deeply unsettling. The attic door had been locked since their arrival, the key still untouched in Eleanor's drawer. Yet the footsteps persisted, deliberate and slow, as though something above paced back and forth with purpose. The realization that several servants had encountered these phantom movements independently forced the sisters to confront a possibility far more unsettling than coincidence, a presence in the house that did not belong to any of them, yet moved as if it had every right to be there. The discovery of the undocumented room began with something small, almost unremarkable, yet out of place enough to draw attention. Eleanor had been inspecting the east wing corridor, noting the warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper, when she noticed a faint draft drifting from behind a section of wall that should have been solid. It was a subtle, cool current that didn't match the suffocating summer heat pressing through the rest of the house. She paused, placing her hand against the faded wallpaper, and felt the unmistakable sensation of hollow space on the other side. The wall sounded wrong when tapped, not dense like the others, but thin and strangely resonant, as though concealing an absence rather than a structure. Maribel arrived moments later, summoned by Eleanor's unsteady voice, and together they examined the peculiar stretch of wall. The pattern of the wallpaper aligned perfectly with the rest of the hallway, yet the seams here were uneven, lifted just enough to suggest they had been pressed down hastily, perhaps years after the original installation. A servant named Ruth fetched a lantern, illuminating the corridor with a wavering glow that brought out the damp sheen of the plaster. The light revealed faint scratches near the floor, marks that might have been clawed or carved in movements too frantic to be deliberate. Caleb suggested gently peeling the wallpaper back, though his voice quivered with hesitation, as if he feared disturbing something better left alone. With slow, careful motions, Eleanor loosened the edges until a section pulled away, revealing a narrow vertical outline etched into the plaster. It was unmistakably a doorway, hidden, sealed, and forgotten. The handle had been removed entirely, leaving a shallow indentation where it had once sat. The edges bore signs of force, suggesting that someone, at some point, had attempted to pry it open or shut it firmly against intrusion. The sight sent an uncomfortable ripple through everyone present. The house had already shown itself to be full of strange noises and shifting shadows, but this discovery felt intentional, a purposeful concealment rather than the result of age or decay. Maribel traced the outline with trembling fingers, imagining what might be sealed behind it. The servants exchanged wary looks, each silently weighing the possibility that the source of the whispers, the footsteps, and the roaming figures had been hidden here all along. When Caleb finally wedged a tool into the crease and pried the false wall loose, the wood groaned like something exhaling after a long confinement. The door behind it, dark, narrow, and unmarked, stood slightly ajar, though none of them had touched it. A chill seeped from the opening, thicker and colder than any draft, carrying with it a faint odor of old paper, damp earth, and something else none of them could identify. The corridor fell silent. Even the house seemed to hold its breath as they faced the entrance to a room none of them, not even the oldest estate records, had ever mentioned. The room behind the sealed door was smaller than expected, a narrow chamber with a low ceiling that made everyone instinctively duck as they stepped inside. Dust hovered in the lantern light like drifting ash, disturbed only now after what must have been decades of untouched stillness. The air carried a stale heaviness, thick with the scent of forgotten years, and the faint metallic tinge of rust or something older. Shelves lined the walls, warped by moisture and eaten at the edges by time, yet they held few objects, only scraps of paper, brittle pieces of cloth, and a handful of trinkets too tarnished to identify. It was clear the room had once been used for something specific, something that required secrecy, because nothing about it suggested ordinary storage. It felt more like a place meant to hide knowledge rather than possessions. Eleanor was the first to notice the journal. It lay on a narrow table near the back of the chamber, half covered by a sheet of rotted fabric that disintegrated when she touched it. The leather binding was cracked, brittle, and warped by moisture, but surprisingly intact. Marybelle hesitated, unsure whether opening it would violate something sacred or dangerous, yet curiosity tugged at her with a stubborn persistence. When she lifted the cover, the pages gave a soft sigh, as if awakening from a long, uneasy sleep. The handwriting inside was jagged and hurried, the ink faded but legible enough to convey the unease of whoever had written it. The earliest entries spoke of routine household matters, the kind expected of a caretaker or someone responsible for overseeing the estate, but gradually the tone shifted. Lines became more fragmented, descriptions more frantic, and a recurring phrase appeared along the margins: "The debt returns." The sisters exchanged uneasy looks, sensing that these words carried a meaning deeper than superstition. Several entries mentioned strange occurrences around the estate, sudden chills, whispered voices, and figures glimpsed in the periphery. The writer described them not with fear, but resignation, as though such disturbances were an unavoidable inheritance tied to the Vane lineage. Marybelle turned to a page near the center, where the ink had bled through in dark strokes, as if written with trembling urgency. It referenced an old pact made generations before, something involving both the Vane family and those who had served them. Though the details were vague, the writer hinted that the agreement had been fractured in a way that endangered everyone tied to the land. The entries ended abruptly after notes of sleepless nights, unexplainable shadows, and a final chilling line: "If the pact breaks, the house will stir." The room seemed colder as the sisters closed the journal, the lantern's light flickering unevenly as though reacting to the revelation. The servants shifted anxiously, sensing that whatever was written there was not merely the ramblings of a frightened ancestor, but a warning meant for those who would inevitably return. The shared nightmares began subtly, creeping into the household like a slow-moving fog that no one noticed until it settled heavily over them all. It started with Marybelle, who woke one morning pale and trembling, unable to recall details yet certain she had seen something standing at the foot of her bed, a figure she couldn't describe but could still feel, like a residue clinging to her thoughts. She tried to dismiss it as a consequence of reading the journal, but Eleanor soon reported her own restless night, speaking of corridors stretching impossibly long and a presence following her through the dark. Neither sister mentioned these dreams to the servants, not wishing to stir more worry, yet the signs of unease spread throughout the estate long before words were exchanged. Ruth was the first servant to voice her experience. She approached Eleanor in the kitchen with hesitant steps, her hands trembling as she described a nightmare in which she walked through the east wing only to find every door open and a shadow lingering behind each threshold, shifting subtly as if waiting for her to choose one. Caleb admitted he had been waking drenched in sweat, dreaming of whispering voices circling him in the attic, though he had never been inside that room. The servants exchanged troubled glances, recognizing details in each other's stories they had not disclosed. The nightmares were not merely similar, they were intertwined, as if drawn from a single source. As the nights progressed, the dreams grew more vivid, more invasive. They no longer felt like isolated terrors but fragments of a shared hallucination, weaving through each sleeper in a pattern none of them fully understood. Eleanor found herself returning repeatedly to the same dream, standing before the sealed room, hearing a heartbeat pulsing from behind the door. Marybelle dreamed of wandering the gardens only to see the house watching her, its windows shifting like eyes tracking her movements. The servants dreamed of footsteps pacing around their beds, slow and measured, stopping only when they dared to open their eyes. What unsettled them most was that the dreams carried sensations, cold drafts, distant murmurs, the weight of an unseen gaze, that lingered long after waking. Ruth once insisted she felt a hand brush her shoulder in sleep, and the imprint remained, chilled and unmistakable, even when dawn broke. Caleb spoke of a voice whispering his name in the dream, only to wake and hear the echo continue faintly in the waking world. The realization settled gradually but undeniably: they were no longer dreaming independently. Something in the house was binding their minds together, feeding them visions threaded with the same hidden knowledge, the same looming dread. It was as though the estate itself was drawing them into its memory, forcing them to confront whatever had stirred when the sealed room was opened, revealing a truth nothing in daylight could soften. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in from the horizon with a violence that seemed almost intentional, as though the sky itself had decided to trap the inhabitants of the Vane estate. Hours before the first raindrop fell, the air shifted, growing dense, metallic, and charged with an electric tension that raised the fine hairs on every arm it brushed past. Birds fled the trees in frantic bursts, disappearing into the darkened woods. Even the horses sensed the change, pacing their stalls with restless agitation. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, each silently acknowledging the same thought: the house had been growing more unsettling by the day, and now nature seemed to conspire with it. When the storm finally broke, it did so with a fury that drowned out every other sound. Rain hammered the roof in relentless waves, turning the surrounding fields into churning pools of mud. Thunder cracked so close to the estate that the windows shuddered in their frames, and lightning streaked across the sky in jagged forks that illuminated the house in stark, ghostly flashes. Within an hour, the road leading from the property had vanished beneath rising water, and the bridges, already old and weakened by neglect, were rendered impassable. No one would be leaving until the storm decided to lift, and it showed no inclination of mercy. Inside, the atmosphere grew increasingly claustrophobic. The distant echoes that had haunted the house seemed closer now, the walls reverberating with layers of sound that felt unnervingly human beneath the thunder. Eleanor tried to maintain calm, insisting the storm was nothing more than nature's cycle, but even she could not ignore the way the house reacted, its groans deeper, its shadows shifting more boldly in the flickering lamplight. The servants huddled together in the parlor, their usual tasks abandoned, as though instinct told them not to wander alone during a storm like this. Marybelle noticed it first: the storm seemed to amplify the strange presence within the estate. Each flash of lightning revealed brief glimpses of movement at the corners of her vision, figures that vanished before she could focus. Doors trembled on their hinges, though no draft passed through. The air carried an intermittent chill that swept through the corridors like a breath from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. With the outside world cut off, the house felt alive in a way that defied reason, responding to the storm not with fear but with recognition, as if awakening fully beneath the pressure of the fierce weather. By the second night, none of them slept. The shared nightmares had followed them into waking hours, blurring the line between dream and reality until each shadow seemed sentient, each sound deliberate. The storm, unrelenting and loud, became a cage around the estate, ensuring that whatever had been stirring within its walls was now their sole company, and escape, however desperately desired, was impossible. The footsteps in the attic began during the second night of the storm, when the household had settled into an uneasy silence broken only by thunder and the groans of the old structure. Caleb was the first to mention them, though he hesitated, as if saying the words aloud might give the sounds greater power. He had been passing through the upstairs corridor with a lantern when he heard the distinct rhythm of footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate, and impossibly steady for a place no one had entered in decades. At first, he convinced himself it was simply the storm battering the roof, but the cadence was wrong, too measured, too intentional, too human. When he told Eleanor, she dismissed it gently, attributing the noise to shifting beams or swollen wood reacting to the weather. But later that night, she heard the same pattern while lying awake in her room. The footsteps traveled from one end of the attic to the other, paused directly above her, then resumed, as if pacing. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the weight of someone walking across old planks, accompanied by a subtle creaking that matched each step. Eleanor sat up abruptly, her breath caught in her throat, listening as the pacing continued with unbroken patience. It felt purposeful, as though the unseen figure was waiting for something, or counting the seconds until she reacted. Maribel, too, heard the footsteps. She was drifting uneasily between sleep and waking when the noise pulled her back into awareness. At first, she tried to keep her eyes closed, hoping the sound would fade, but it only grew clearer. It moved with unsettling precision: 5 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause, a long drag as though something heavy was shifted, then silence, followed by the same pattern repeating minutes later. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the vibration seemed to pulse through the ceiling itself, making it impossible to block out. By morning, the servants confirmed they had heard the same thing. Ruth described waking to a noise like someone kneeling on the floor directly above her, followed by a dragging sound that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Even the most skeptical among them admitted the attic footsteps did not resemble the chaotic pounding of storm winds or settling beams. These sounds were too deliberate, too sentient. The most disturbing detail came when Caleb retrieved the attic key from Eleanor's drawer at her request. The keyhole was stiff from disuse, and when they finally forced the door open, a cloud of dust drifted into the hallway, confirming that no one, absolutely no one, had stepped inside for years. The floor was coated with an unbroken layer of dust, smooth except for a strange pattern near the far wall where the dust seemed to swirl in irregular spirals, as though disturbed by movement that left no footprints. They stood at the threshold, lanterns trembling in their hands, feeling the unmistakable truth settle over them like a heavy veil. Something had been pacing in the attic, yet whatever it was left no trace of its passage. The disappearance happened on the 3rd night of the storm, when the house felt tighter around them than ever before, its walls seeming to listen as the household moved uneasily from room to room. Samuel, one of the younger servants, had been the most visibly shaken by the strange occurrences, often glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to be standing behind him. He slept little, woke frequently, and spoke of the shared nightmares with a tremor in his voice. Yet despite his fear, he tried to continue his duties, perhaps believing that routine might anchor him against the rising dread within the estate. On that night, however, routine abandoned him. He had been sent to fetch extra candles from the storage room at the far end of the west wing, an area already avoided by most of the servants because of the cold drafts and the sense that the shadows there shifted just a little too slowly. Samuel left with a lantern and a muttered reassurance that he would return quickly, though none of them missed the unease in his eyes. Minutes passed, then an hour, and when the storm surged louder, swallowing every sound of the house, they realized he had never returned. Caleb volunteered to search first, though his steps were hesitant as he moved through the dim, flickering hallways. The west wing felt colder than the rest of the house, the sort of cold that seeped into the skin. When he reached the storage room, the lantern light barely penetrated the corners. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly as the storm pushed wind through unseen cracks. Inside, the shelves were undisturbed, the dust thick, unmarked. The candles were untouched. Samuel's lantern lay near the entrance, still warm to the touch but its flame completely extinguished, as though someone had snuffed it out rather than the wind. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no displaced objects, no torn fabric or overturned crates. It was as if Samuel had simply stepped into the room and dissolved into the shadows. Eleanor and Maribel joined the search, calling his name through the echoing corridors. Their voices carried strangely, bouncing back to them in distorted tones that sounded thinner, more distant, as if filtered through water. Each time they paused to listen, the silence pressed against them with unnatural heaviness. Ruth claimed later that while searching the main hall she heard Samuel's voice calling from somewhere deep within the house, a faint, wavering plea that sent her fleeing toward the others. Caleb insisted he heard footsteps retreating just ahead of him, always a few paces beyond reach, guiding him deeper into the darkness. When they regrouped, shaken and empty-handed, the realization settled over them like a suffocating shroud: Samuel had not walked out of the estate. Something inside had taken him, and whatever had called his name during the nights before had finally claimed its answer. Eleanor first heard the whispering from the well on a morning so still it felt as though the storm had drained the world of breath. The air was thick with lingering moisture, making every surface glisten faintly under the gray light. She had gone outside to clear her thoughts, hoping the open space would quiet the unease that had settled in her chest since Samuel's disappearance. The estate grounds were eerily calm, the trees motionless, the sky muted and heavy. Even the cicadas, usually relentless, were silent, as if the storm had pressed its weight onto every living thing. Eleanor followed the worn path that led toward the old stone well situated at the edge of the overgrown gardens. It had been there for generations, a relic from when the estate first took shape, and though rarely used now, it stood like a sentinel watching over the land. As she neared it, she felt the air shift, cooling suddenly around her. She paused, her fingers tightening around the shawl draped over her shoulders. At first, she heard nothing but the faint drip of water echoing from its depths. Then, carried so softly she almost mistook it for wind, came the whisper. A fragile thread of sound rising from the darkness below. It curved upward with eerie precision, slipping through the moss-covered stones and curling into her ears in a tone she recognized instantly. It was her own voice. The realization froze her where she stood. The whisper was faint, distorted, like a distant echo traveling through layers of time, but unmistakably hers, the same cadence, the same softness, murmuring words she couldn't understand. She leaned closer despite the cold prickling along her spine. The voice repeated, slightly clearer this time, though still warped, as if submerged beneath water. She felt as though she were listening to a memory she had never lived. A shiver traveled across her skin. The whisper wasn't calling her name, it was speaking to her in a tone resembling warning, or pleading. She stepped back, heart pounding. The voice followed, rising in urgency, still faint but insistent, as though whatever lurked in the well sensed her retreat and sought to draw her back. The wind remained absent, yet the surrounding trees rustled faintly, bending toward the well as if listening too. Maribel found her moments later, standing rigid, eyes fixed on the stone rim. Eleanor tried to speak, but the words tangled on her tongue. When she finally managed to say what she'd heard, the servants exchanged fearful glances. They knew the house had begun to mimic voices at night, but the idea that something outside, something beneath the earth, could imitate Eleanor's own voice unsettled them all. As they pulled her away from the well, Eleanor glanced back one last time. The whisper had stopped, but the darkness within seemed to pulse, as though waiting for her to return. Maribel had always been the steadier of the two sisters, the one who maintained composure even as the estate's unease deepened. But on the morning she discovered the carved symbol on her skin, something in her changed, subtly at first, then with a quiet dread she could no longer mask. She awoke before dawn, the room washed in a dim gray light that filtered through the storm-heavy sky. Her sleep had been restless, filled with fragments of dreams she could not fully recall, cold hands brushing her arms, a voice she could not place humming low and steady, a sensation of being pulled through a narrow space where no air existed. Yet it was not the dreams that drew her abruptly from sleep, it was the burning sting along her forearm. She pushed back the blankets and froze. Etched across her pale skin, just below the elbow, was a thin, curved mark the color of old ash. It wasn't a cut, no blood, no broken skin, but rather something pressed deep beneath the surface, as though the flesh itself had rearranged to form the shape. The symbol resembled a looping crescent intersected by a straight line, simple at first glance yet filled with an unsettling sense of intention. It pulsed faintly, not with light but with warmth, as if reacting to her gaze. Maribel touched it, and a sharp chill shot through her arm, forcing her to pull her hand away. She sat there trembling, unable to decide whether to call for Eleanor or hide the mark entirely. The room felt heavier than usual, its corners thick with shadow, as though the darkness itself had been watching the moment she awoke. She remembered none of the night, no accident that could explain it, no sharp object or fall. The symbol had been placed there in silence, under cover of sleep. When she finally gathered the courage to show Eleanor, her sister's face drained of color. Eleanor traced the air above the symbol cautiously, unwilling to touch it, yet even hovering her hand nearby brought a faint vibration, like static humming beneath the skin. The servants, when they heard, approached with wary eyes. Ruth crossed herself instinctively, recognizing it not as a random mark but something deliberate, ritualistic, even. Caleb insisted he had seen a similar pattern in the old journal, sketched faintly in the margins near the entries about the fractured pact, but the journal's damaged pages made it impossible to confirm. Maribel tried to maintain calm, but as the hours passed, she felt increasingly aware of the mark, sensing it throb with a slow rhythm not her own. Whenever she stood near certain rooms of the estate, particularly the sealed chamber, they felt colder, the air tightening around her. The symbol seemed to react, warming against her skin, as though guiding her or binding her to something deep within the house. As the day wore on, a quiet fear settled among them all. The mark was not an injury. It was an invitation, a claim, or a warning, one laid upon her by something that had visited while she slept, leaving behind a message carved not in words but into her very flesh. Eleanor had never feared silence before, yet the quiet that settled over Maribel that evening unnerved her more deeply than any sound could have. As the sun drifted below the tree line, she found her sister seated at the vanity, her posture rigid, her reflection strangely distant. The lamp beside her flickered with an almost deliberate rhythm, as though responding to her presence. Eleanor spoke her name softly, careful not to startle her, but Maribel did not turn. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, watching something Eleanor could not see. Only when Eleanor touched her shoulder did Maribel blink and look away, seeming confused by the interruption, as if she had momentarily forgotten she was not alone. Throughout the night, Eleanor observed a growing detachment in her sister, a subtle withdrawing from the living world, replaced by a focus on something inward and unseen. Maribel drifted from room to room without purpose, her movements slow and deliberate, the marked arm hanging just slightly heavier than the other. At times she paused in doorways, leaning in as though listening for a voice beneath the hum of the house. When questioned, she dismissed her behavior with a soft laugh that carried no lightness, claiming she was simply tired, but her eyes betrayed the truth. She was hearing something, sensing something, following something none of them could perceive. When Ruth tried to speak with her later in the kitchen, Maribel stood so still that even the steady clatter of dishes felt loud beside her. Ruth noticed the faintest whisper escape Maribel's lips, not spoken to her, but directed at the empty space just over her shoulder, as if responding to someone who stood inches away. Caleb watched from a distance, his expression darkening with a recognition he refused to voice. He had seen such detachment described in old accounts of bindings and marks, signs that the touched individual had begun to cross an unseen threshold where the mind straddled two realms. That night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of her sister's footsteps. She followed quietly, heart pounding as Maribel walked through the corridor with purposeful slowness, her gaze fixed ahead. She made her way to the sealed chamber door and stopped, her breath steady, her expression serene in a way that chilled Eleanor to the bone. Maribel placed her marked arm against the wood, and the symbol glowed faintly beneath her skin as though responding to whatever lay behind the door. Eleanor called her name, voice trembling, but Maribel did not turn. Her eyes remained forward, unblinking, entranced by something beyond the veil of the visible world. It was in that moment Eleanor realized her sister was no longer merely marked, she was being guided, drawn gradually away from them, slipping into a communion with something neither living nor benign. Eleanor had always thought the locked cellar beneath the east wing was merely another relic of the estate's neglected past, a storage place for broken furniture and forgotten crates. But when the servants finally unearthed the decaying ledger, wrapped in rotting cloth and buried beneath loose floorboards, it became clear the cellar had once served a darker purpose. The ledger itself was fragile, its pages warped by moisture and time, its ink faded to the color of dried moss. Ruth found it first, clutching it in shaking hands as though afraid it might crumble to dust if she breathed too hard. Even before they opened it, a foul, earthy scent drifted from it, as though it carried with it the damp breath of the ground it had been hiding in for decades. When they gathered around the kitchen table to examine it, the room felt colder, the oil lamps flickering as if disturbed by a draught. Caleb turned the pages with deliberate care, revealing entries written in a hurried, uneven hand. Most were dated around the mid-1800s, during the time of the First Pact. The early entries seemed ordinary, inventory lists, scattered notes about repairs to the property, but gradually the handwriting changed, becoming erratic, letters stretched thin or pressed so hard they tore the page. The language grew cryptic, filled with references to rituals carried out beneath the estate, rituals involving the original sisters and their bound servants. The ledger hinted at ceremonies meant to secure loyalty, longevity, and protection, written in a tone that suggested the writer had begun to fear the very forces they had called upon. One fragment described a night when the boundary between the house and some unseen realm shifted, allowing something ancient to step through. Another entry spoke of symbols carved into skin, not as punishment, but as anchors, marks that tethered chosen individuals to a force that demanded reciprocity. The final legible page contained a warning, scrawled across the paper as if the writer knew they were running out of time. Once marked, the bond cannot be undone. Guard the sealed chamber. It listens. As Caleb read aloud, Maribel stood behind them, silent and unmoving, her eyes fixed on the page as though she already knew its contents. Eleanor felt a creeping dread, realizing that the ledger did not merely explain the past, it mirrored the events unfolding around them now. Every detail, every symbol, every whispered ritual from the history of the estate seemed to be awakening again. The ledger was not a record, it was a foretelling. And Maribel, marked and drifting further into the unseen, had become part of a cycle that had begun long before any of them were born, a cycle that the ledger suggested had never truly been broken. Eleanor had always believed the sealed chamber was simply a room locked out of necessity, a place the original owners had abandoned after the structure weakened or the roof began to sag. But when the quiet vibrations in the walls intensified, when Maribel's mark glowed strongest near that specific door, and when the ledger's final warning echoed the same room by name, Eleanor knew she could no longer avoid the truth. The chamber was not sealed to keep people out, it was sealed to keep something in. And as Maribel drifted ever closer to it, drawn by a force she could neither fight nor understand, Eleanor felt a rising urgency to uncover what lay behind it before her sister crossed a threshold she might never return from. They gathered at the entrance late in the evening when the estate felt most still, carrying with them the ledger, a lantern, and a bundle of keys Ruth believed belonged to the old wing. The wood of the door was warped and cold to the touch, unnaturally cold for a room that should have shared the same temperature as the rest of the house. Caleb ran his fingers along the frame, noticing symbols carved deep into the wood, symbols nearly identical to the one on Maribel's arm. The marks were faint but deliberate, arranged in a pattern that suggested containment, not decoration. As the lantern light flickered across them, they seemed to waver, as though reacting to their presence. When Eleanor tried the first key, the lock resisted, groaning in a low, almost organic way. The second key fit, but the mechanism turned with unsettling ease, as if the chamber had been waiting for someone to release it. A stale breath of air seeped out from the crack as the door shifted slightly, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something older, something metallic and faintly sweet. Ruth stepped back immediately, clutching her apron, whispering a prayer under her breath. Caleb raised the lantern and gently pushed the door open. Inside, the room was not empty. The walls were covered in faded inscriptions, painted in thick strokes that suggested haste or desperation. Some symbols were smeared, some crossed out, others half-finished as though someone had been interrupted mid-ritual. In the center of the floor lay a circle made of brittle, crumbling material, salt or chalk or something mixed with ash. The circle had been broken long ago, a jagged gap running through one side. Eleanor felt a sharp chill as she stepped closer, sensing an almost tangible weight in the air, like the lingering presence of someone who had just left. Caleb found remnants of rope, bits of fabric, and a rusted metal bowl stained with something that time had not fully erased. The ledger's warnings finally made sense. This chamber had been the site of the original binding, the heart of the pact that had anchored an unseen force to the estate. And the broken circle suggested the pact had not ended naturally, it had been severed, perhaps violently, leaving whatever had been summoned restless and uncontained. The room did not feel abandoned, it felt paused, as though waiting to continue what had once begun. And as the lantern light wavered across the broken symbols, Eleanor understood something with a chilling certainty: Maribel's mark was not an accident. It was the beginning of the chamber waking again. The night the whispers began in earnest was the night Eleanor realized the house was no longer merely reacting to Maribel, it was addressing her. The change was subtle at first, so slight that Eleanor convinced herself she was imagining it. But as darkness settled over the estate and the lanterns cast long, trembling shadows upon the walls, Maribel walked with a stillness that did not belong to her. Her movements were too deliberate, too quiet, as though guided by instructions only she could hear. She paused often, head tilted faintly, her eyes unfocused as if listening to someone positioned just out of sight. When Eleanor asked what she heard, Maribel smiled with a softness that carried no warmth, murmuring that the house was finally speaking clearly. That evening, as the wind swept through the trees and the old beams groaned with age, Maribel sat in the parlor alone, the light of a single candle illuminating her face. Eleanor lingered at the doorway, unwilling to enter yet unable to walk away. She watched as Maribel's lips parted slightly, responding to some unseen voice, the cadence of her breath matching a rhythm Eleanor could not detect. The mark on her arm pulsed faintly, each glow synchronized with her whispered replies. Though Eleanor strained to hear, the other side of the conversation remained silent, cloaked in an eerie absence that pressed against her ears like a held breath. Caleb noticed the change as well. He found Maribel in the hallway outside the sealed chamber, standing perfectly still with her hand placed flat against the wall. Her eyes were half closed, her expression serene in a way that unsettled him deeply. He called her name, louder than he meant to, and she turned with a slow, graceful movement, as though emerging from a trance. She spoke to him gently, too gently, assuring him that everything was unfolding as intended, using phrasing that did not belong to her usual vocabulary. The words carried an odd resonance, as if echoed from another source. Ruth, meanwhile, began hearing faint murmurs in the kitchen whenever Marybelle entered the room. Pots rattled on shelves without being touched, cabinet doors creaked open on their own, and the flame beneath the stove flickered violently before steadying as Marybelle passed by. It was as though the house acknowledged her presence with small gestures, greeting her like a long-awaited guest. Ruth confessed to Eleanor that she felt watched, not by Marybelle herself but by whatever had intertwined with her. As the whispers grew stronger, more insistent, Marybelle's connection to the estate deepened. She moved through it with an eerie certainty, pausing in places no one had shown her, touching objects she had never been told about, knowing which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent. Eleanor realized with growing dread that her sister was no longer simply listening, she was being taught, guided step by step toward a role the house had chosen long before their time. The onset of Marybelle's first blackout came without warning, though looking back, Eleanor would recall countless signs that something inside her sister had already begun to slip. It happened on a damp, windless night when the air hung heavy, pressing down upon the estate like an unseen hand. Eleanor had been reading by lamplight when she heard a faint thud somewhere down the corridor, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something being dragged. Her heart tightened as she rose, calling Marybelle's name gently at first, then with growing urgency. There was no reply, only the dull hum of the house settling into its nocturnal stillness. She found Marybelle standing at the end of the hallway, her posture unusual, her shoulders lifted slightly as though she were listening with her entire body. Her eyes were open but vacant, unfocused, reflecting the dim light without recognition. Eleanor approached slowly, fearing that a sudden movement might startle her, but Marybelle did not respond even when Eleanor stood directly before her. Her breathing was shallow, rhythmic, almost meditative. Eleanor reached out to touch her arm, and only then did she notice the mark glowing beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve, pulsing with an uncanny precision. When Marybelle finally blinked and exhaled, it was as though she were returning from a deep place rather than waking from a momentary daze. She swayed slightly and caught herself against the wall. Her first word sent a chill through Eleanor: "How did I get here?" Her voice trembled with genuine confusion, her gaze darting down the corridor as though searching for something familiar that had slipped away. Eleanor explained where she had found her, but Marybelle shook her head, insisting she had been in her room moments earlier, reading by candlelight. The gap in her memory was not minutes long but nearly an hour, lost with no trace of recognition. Caleb examined the hallway and found faint markings on the floor, scratches that resembled the dragging noise Eleanor had heard. They trailed from the end of the corridor toward the sealed chamber, stopping abruptly near the door. But there was no sign of anything having been moved, no displaced furniture, no footprint other than Marybelle's soft impressions on the dust-covered boards. The absence of evidence made the scratches even more unsettling, as though the house had tried to erase its own movements except for what it wanted them to notice. Throughout the night, Marybelle struggled to recall anything from the missing hour. Whenever she strained to remember, the mark on her arm tightened like a band drawn too close to the bone, and she recoiled from its invisible sting. Eleanor remained by her side, but she sensed her sister drifting further, pulled by a force indifferent to their attempts to anchor her. The blackout was not an isolated event, it was a threshold. Something had stepped forward, claiming its first true moment of control, and Marybelle's mind had begun to fracture beneath the weight of an influence she could neither comprehend nor resist. After Marybelle's blackout, the atmosphere inside the estate changed in a way none of them could ignore. The air grew denser, as though every breath carried the weight of something watching, measuring, preparing. But the most alarming shift began not with Marybelle herself, but with the house's sudden tendency to react, subtly at first, then with a bizarre intentionality, to her presence. Eleanor was the first to notice that the temperature changed wherever Marybelle walked. A room warm from daylight would fall cold within moments of her entering, as if the walls exhaled frost in greeting. When she left, the temperature crept back toward normal, though never fully recovering, as though the imprint of her passage lingered like a shadow refusing to fade. Objects, too, began to respond. The old portraits along the hallway would tilt slightly as she approached, their frames creaking as though straining toward her. The parlor curtains fluttered despite closed windows, brushing against her shoulders with a soft, almost affectionate motion. Even the wooden floorboards seemed to shift, swelling or tightening beneath her feet, creating a muted resonance that followed her from room to room. Eleanor tried to explain these events rationally: humidity changes, aging timber, poor insulation, but each excuse crumbled beneath the sheer consistency of the occurrences. The reactions were not random. They were synchronized with Maribel, as if the house recognized her on a level beyond the physical. Ruth, ever alert to the uncanny, refused to step into any room Maribel had just left without making the sign of protection she'd carried since childhood. She insisted the shadows moved differently around Maribel, stretching too far or receding too quickly, as though forming shapes they abandoned the moment someone looked directly. Caleb, though wary of superstition, could not deny what he witnessed. Tools in the cellar rattled on their hooks when Maribel descended the stairs. The lantern sputtered violently as she passed, flaring brighter for a heartbeat before dimming into a trembling glow. Once, in the library, every book on the nearest shelf shifted outward in perfect unison the instant she reached for a volume, as though offering themselves to her. Maribel herself remained caught in a haze of confusion, sensing these changes but unable or unwilling to admit their significance. At times she claimed she felt the house breathing near her cheek, a faint warmth brushing her skin like a whispered welcome. At other moments she insisted something stood behind her, unseen but unmistakably present, guiding her steps the way a steady hand might guide a child learning to walk. She spoke of familiarity, of a strange comfort growing within her, as if the estate were no longer a place she lived in but a presence she belonged to. Eleanor watched helplessly as her sister's identity seemed to blur, becoming intertwined with the house's eerie attentiveness. The estate was no longer merely reacting, it was aligning itself with Maribel, drawing her deeper into its ancient pulse. And with each passing day, Eleanor feared more profoundly that the house was not simply aware of Maribel's presence, it had chosen her. The scratching began as a faint, almost dismissible sound, so soft that Eleanor first mistook it for the scurrying of small creatures behind the walls. But as days passed, the noise grew deliberate, rhythmic, and disturbingly aware. It started each night just after the lamps were extinguished, echoing through the corridors with a slow, persistent drag. The sound always seemed to come from just beyond the nearest wall or beneath the floorboards directly under Maribel's room. It was too steady to be animal, too heavy to be tree branches against the siding. And worst of all, it always stopped the moment anyone other than Maribel approached. Eleanor first realized the scratching was intelligent when she heard it adjust itself to Maribel's movements. If Maribel crossed the hallway, the sound shifted to follow her, dragging along the inner structure of the wall as though something on the other side mirrored her steps. When she paused, the scratching paused. When she turned around, it seemed to anticipate her, already moving to the next point of the wall before she could reach it, like a shadow eager to greet its owner. It was as though something trapped within the bones of the house was mapping her path, learning her rhythm, waiting for the right moment to emerge. One night, Caleb pressed his ear against the plaster where the scratching grew loudest. He stumbled back with visible alarm, insisting he heard not just scraping but a faint, labored breathing. Ruth refused to go near the affected walls at all, claiming she felt a cold pulse emanating from the wood, a heartbeat that did not belong to any human being. She particularly avoided the hallway outside the sealed chamber, where the sound grew most insistent. There, the scratching intensified to a frenzied pace whenever Maribel walked by, as though the entity behind the wall recognized her presence and strained toward her with desperate urgency. Maribel herself reacted strangely. Instead of fear, she seemed entranced, drawn to the noise with an uncanny calm. She would stand by the wall for long stretches of time, her head tilted as though deciphering a language embedded within the sound. Sometimes her fingers hovered just inches from the plaster, trembling softly, as though resisting the urge to respond. Eleanor noticed the mark on Maribel's arm growing warm and luminous in the candlelight whenever the scratching was nearby, pulsing in quiet conversation with whatever lingered in the unseen spaces of the house. Over several nights, the pattern of the scratching became more complex, forming sequences that repeated but slowly evolved, like coded messages shaping themselves through trial and error. Caleb believed the thing was attempting communication. Ruth believed it was attempting escape. Eleanor feared it was attempting possession. But the most chilling aspect emerged only after Maribel whispered, in a dreamy, faraway voice, that the scratching was not trapped at all. It was waiting for permission, and it knew she was the one meant to give it. The night Maribel vanished from her bed was the night the estate finally revealed how thin the barrier had become. It began in the early hours before dawn, when the house felt suspended in a breathless quiet, the kind of silence that settles only when something is preparing to move. Eleanor awoke with a start, unsure what had jolted her from sleep until she noticed the faint glow beneath her door, an amber flicker that pulsed irregularly, as though a lantern were swaying in an unsteady hand. She rose and opened the door to find the hallway drenched in a wavering light, yet no lantern hung from any hook, no servant carried a candle, and the source of the illumination seemed to shift the moment she tried to focus on it. She hurried to Maribel's room, dread clenching her chest before she even reached the threshold. The door stood open, gently tapping the wall as though someone had just slipped through. Inside, the bedding was rumpled, the pillow still indented where Maribel's head had lain. But she was gone. The window was closed, the floorboards undisturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. Only one detail broke the eerie stillness, the mark on Maribel's pillowcase, faint but unmistakable, an imprint of her glowing symbol burned into the linen like a brand cooling after contact. Eleanor called her name repeatedly, her voice cracking as she searched the corridors. Caleb and Ruth joined moments later, both pale and trembling, admitting they had heard something earlier, a soft series of footsteps accompanied by low humming, as though someone were being led through the house in a trance. They had dismissed it at the time, telling themselves it was the wind threading through the old beams, but now the humming echoed in their minds with sinister clarity. As they fanned out in search of her, the house seemed to guide them, though not in any comforting way. Doors creaked open just before they touched them. Shadows shifted down the hall as though marking a path. The strange light continued to flicker, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, always just out of reach. When Eleanor reached the staircase leading to the lower levels, she felt an unnatural cold curl around her ankles, tightening its grip as though urging her downward. The cellar door, normally swollen shut from years of dampness, stood ajar. A faint sound rose from below, a scraping, a distant thud, and beneath it all, Maribel's voice murmuring in a tone that was both familiar and hollow. Eleanor descended despite the others' warnings, driven by a terror sharpened by love. The air thickened as she reached the bottom step, the flickering light now steady and bright, illuminating what lay before her. At the far end of the cellar, the wall itself had shifted, revealing a narrow opening that had never existed before. The scratching had carved it. And standing just inside the threshold was Maribel, her back turned, her posture relaxed, as though she were simply waiting for someone to join her. The mark on her arm glowed with steady, confident light, casting long shadows that wavered around her like silent attendants. She did not turn when Eleanor whispered her name. She did not acknowledge them at all. It was then Eleanor understood with icy certainty that Marybelle had not been taken. She had followed. Eleanor stepped through the narrow opening in the cellar wall with a trembling caution, each footfall landing softer than the last as though she feared disturbing something that had long been dormant. The space beyond was a passage, tight, uneven, carved not by human hands but by something that understood the structure of the house intimately, pushing through stone and earth with a slow, methodical certainty. The air was colder here, laced with the scent of damp soil and something metallic beneath it, something that hinted at age and hunger. The flickering light that had guided them now glowed steadily from the walls themselves, illuminating faint symbols etched into the stone, matching the shape of the mark on Marybelle's arm with unsettling precision. Marybelle stood a few paces ahead, still turned away, her posture loose and almost peaceful. The soft murmur of her voice continued, a rhythmic cadence that seemed less like speech and more like recitation. Even from a distance, Eleanor could tell the words didn't belong to any language she recognized. They wove through the air with a strange resonance, vibrating faintly against the stones as though the passageway itself were listening. Caleb and Ruth followed behind, their breaths shallow, eyes fixed on Marybelle with a mixture of fear and helplessness. Caleb held the lantern high, but the light dimmed in his hand as they advanced, paling against the unnatural glow from the walls. The passage widened abruptly into a chamber, hidden deep beneath the estate. It was circular, its walls lined with markings that spiraled toward the ceiling like winding vines. In the center of the floor lay a second circle, this one intact, unbroken, drawn with a precision that defied the trembling stroke seen in the upstairs chamber. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of pale light, responding to Marybelle as she stepped toward it. Eleanor rushed forward, reaching for her sister, but the moment her hand brushed Marybelle's sleeve, a force rippled outward, pushing her back with a strength that stole her breath. The air itself seemed to recoil from her, as though protecting Marybelle from interruption. Marybelle finally turned then, her face serene, her eyes distant yet focused on something beyond human sight. She spoke Eleanor's name softly, her voice layered with another tone beneath it, as though two voices had blended into one. She said she understood now, that the pact was not an act of control but of continuation, that the house had chosen her the way it had chosen the sisters before her. She insisted she wasn't afraid, that she belonged here, that the mark wasn't a curse but an inheritance. As she stepped into the glowing circle, the chamber trembled with a low, resonant hum. The walls brightened, the markings igniting in a spiraling cascade of light. The circle flared, enveloping Marybelle in a cocoon of brilliance. Eleanor called her name again and again, but Marybelle only smiled faintly as the light intensified, swallowing her form until it dissolved into the pulsing glow at the chamber's heart. When the radiance finally dimmed, the circle lay empty, the light fading slowly like a breath settling after exertion. Marybelle was gone, not taken by force but folded into the ancient promise of the estate, claimed fully by the pact that had been waiting generations to be completed.